Hello, everyone. In this video, we're going to continue our conversation about the Orla by connecting it with some of the class theory that we've been developing in the first portion of this course. You'll recall that we started with Lovecraft's basic emotive definition of the weird tale as a story that is meant to inspire a kind of awed listening, dread, or terror of unknown outer forces penetrating into our world. Then we looked at Yoshi's definitions and his subcategorizations, the pseudo-supernatural, supernatural, fantasy weird tales, and quasi-science fiction weird tales. You can take a look at the S.G. Yoshi video for a breakdown of the various different categories. What I'd like you to do is to pause the video, review that section of the video on Yoshi, wherein I define those 4 categories, and then try to identify the appropriate category into which the Orla falls. And also to seek out evidence from the text. Can you justify your response? In your opinion, where does the Orla fall in Yoshi's categories of the weird tale? Secondly, I'd also like you to start thinking about the story itself in general terms in order to better understand the reasons for your attempt at classifying it in one of these different subgenres. In your opinion, do you think the Orla is real, imaginary, or something else? And lastly, if it is ambiguous, or if these multiple possibilities are in fact possibilities, what is the effect of having them on the story and the reader? If Guy de Maupassant has left these possibilities open, why has he done so? Pause the video now and attempt to answer these questions. All right, now that you're done, classifying the Orla is actually somewhat difficult because the position of the Orla relative to Yoshi's categories is, as I suggested in those questions, actually debatable. It could be a pseudo-supernatural work of weird literature. It could be quasi-science fiction, or it could be another category of ambiguous weird tales that we haven't really discussed. Basically, that's just a story that leaves it absolutely unresolved as to the nature of the weird events in the story. Are they supernatural? Are they science fiction? Is it merely a hallucination? We're never actually granted confirmation of one of these categories. It is possible that this is a non-supernatural weird tale, in that it is a pseudo-supernatural work. The Orla is merely a product of the narrator's diseased mind, his mental illness that consumes him by the end of the tale. This is a possibility because although we seem to be granted ocular proof and confirmation by the effects the narrator observes in other characters and the objective documentation that he receives regarding the invasion of these strange, invisible, vampiric creatures that suck the life force out of people from other places or in other places in the world. All of these things, all of these events are mediated to us through the narrator himself. He's writing these things down in his journal. Just as we can't trust his relation of the events that he observes in the immediate moment, so too his reference to these external events and supposed pieces of confirmation, like newspaper articles or books, well, he could be delusional. We can't take them at face value. In the pseudo-supernatural, however, those weird moments are rationalized by the confirmation of the narrator's madness. So we know for certainty that the narrator's madness is the thing that has inspired the hallucinations that made us believe something unnatural, something supernatural was going on. Here we don't quite have that. So it doesn't necessarily quite fit. This could also be a work of quasi-science fiction. Remember that in a work of quasi-science fiction, you have norms that exist in this universe, a set of natural laws that are identical to our own. And many of the things about the narrator's initial positions and his lack of belief in anything that's really supernatural seem to confirm that to us. However, as the story goes on, the narrator becomes convinced that he is beset by a supernatural force. And yet, he then says, no, this creature is likely only a product of biological evolution. If we arose to dominance on this planet as human beings because we evolved beyond the limitations of other species and then mastered them as a result, surely there is something else in human evolution that can displace us in the same way. So in this case, the Orla and all its seemingly magical capabilities to live off the life force of other beings or to supplant them mentally are really just a consequence of scientific laws that have been hitherto unknown. It's merely just a new form of life that has evolved on this planet that seems alien and supernatural, but it's merely because we don't understand how it operates. And the story emphasizes that possibility, or opens up that possibility of it being a quasi-science fiction weird tale, because the narrator's cousin and her encounter with the hypnotist opens up this new sphere of scientific inquiry into mesmerism or hypnotism and the power of the mind to conjure into reality things that wouldn't otherwise exist. If we say that the Orla is merely the next stage of evolution on this planet, the species that will supplant human beings and turn them into chattel slaves, just as we control animals and subjugate them for our purposes, then this could be a work of quasi-science fiction. Now, in this way, this story could be an ambiguous work. S.T. Yoshi, in his treatise on the weird tale and the various different subgenres that you didn't actually read, but that I have referenced to in my discussion of the various different subgenres, said that in an ambiguous weird tale, doubt is maintained to the end whether events are supernatural or not. There's no confirmation as to the narrator's sanity or madness. In this case, may not be any confirmation as to the relationship between the Orla and his madness. Is the Orla an hallucination, a product of his madness, or is the Orla a real creature who is preying upon the narrator, causing him to go insane? Well, if we take this as an ambiguous work of the weird, we can't say either way, and that's why it's ambiguous. I would argue that Guy de Maupassant takes great pains to maintain this level of ambiguity, and there's a reason for that. A parallelism in the experience of the real reader's approach to the text and the way in which the character is experiencing this dwindling, atrophying sanity. And it is a result, partially, of Guy de Maupassant's own attempt to explore, arguably, his dwindling mental faculties. Remember that at this moment in his life, he is slowly descending into madness. His sanity is being taken away from him because of his syphilitic infection. In this story, we have fundamentally an ambiguity that disturbs and prevents closure. We, as human beings, just as we like to compartmentalize things and break the world down into comprehensible categories, like closure. We like things to be tied up into a neat little package so that we can provide definitive answers to the questions that we have. A story or anything in the world that precludes the possibility of engendering or creating that kind of closure frustrates us inherently. That experience of ambiguity, that denial of closure inside the work, parallels the experience of the narrator, the character, and the reader. And this is a unique concern in horror. Horror literature and the weird tale create an almost perfect parallelism between the experiences of the character and the experience of the reader. In a work of action, let's say, you as a reader are experiencing excitement and pleasure, in a sense, at the sight of action being presented to you, at the battles and broils that you see presented to you either in the novel or on screen if you're watching a movie. But think about the emotional experience of the characters. They're not aligned with you. They're not parallel. They're almost anti-parallel. They're running against each other. The characters inside that work of fiction are experiencing horror and terror and desperation. Most of them generally are not experiencing the exhilaration that you feel when taking in that work of action. So works like action or fiction that is in the genre of action or adventure don't have a direct parallel between your emotional experience and those of the characters. In a work of horror, however, that experience is meant to be a signal for you. The way in which the characters react inside the fiction with genuine fictional fear signals to you the way in which that you as a reader or a viewer of this work are meant to react on a visceral level in terms of art horror. So when the character experiences terror or horror, you experience, let's say, art horror or art terror in response. You take those characters, even subconsciously, and use their emotive responses, the terror sweat that breaks out on their brows, the shivering, the anticipatory dread, the way in which the body reacts physically to the sensation of terror, and that begins to play out in you. Think about those movies of suspense where you have been gripped by the narrative and you're waiting for something to happen. What you feel in that moment is not real in the sense that there's nothing that can actually threaten you or to cause that sense of dread. And yet, it's still a parallel experience to the one that the character is, well, or the one that is being described to you through the character's reactions. So, your emotions and your experiences are a parallel. In the Orla, this reality of horror fiction is played out on the level of ambiguity with respect to the character's understanding of what's going on. As he does not know what's going on, as he cannot be certain, and he grasps and gropes blindly to try to understand what's happening, To try to know if the Orla is real, so too do we. It is that lack of knowledge, though unspoken, that contributes to and exacerbates, I think, his growing insanity. In the same way as he cannot know and it helps to drive him mad, so too we cannot know for certain. Our vision is as clouded as his because he is the mediating factor that presents to us the reality or the twisted, tainted reality of the story that was presented. He fixates throughout the entire story on obtaining physical proof. He's constantly looking for newspaper articles, books. He goes to the library to do research. He performs experiments in a pseudoscientific fashion, right? He sets out different things on his bench. He uses milk and water and different kinds of foods. So he's running an experiment over and over again, changing variables as he goes. He's looking for empirical proof. It's precisely because his sanity is slipping away from him that he is looking for evidence. He's looking for something outside of his own mind that is physical. The causal relationship between his dwindling sanity and the existence of the Orla is, of course, the very reason that he appeals to his faculty of, well, reason. And yet, it's this recursive, cyclical, self-destructive, and self-defeating process because he can never obtain the proof that he wants. All the empirical evidence that he observes is filtered to him through his mind in the same way that all the empirical evidence that seems to confirm his belief about the Orla is filtered to us through his narration. He is attempting to use his reason in order to assert it, define it, and defend that it is operating appropriately. It's precisely because he's afraid that his reason is failing him, that he's going insane, that he constantly appeals to that reason. And that creates a parallel experience between what he is enduring and what we're enduring. Now, Maupassant is using that struggle on his part and the parallelism between the feelings of the character and the feeling of the reader and the experience of the reader trying to determine whether the Orla is real and the experience of the narrator trying to determine whether the Orla is real in order to create a more effective horror narrative. The work is terrifying, or the work seeks to be terrifying or to create this sense of dread because possibilities never coalesce into reality. We're never given an answer. Remember that horror story, the world's shortest horror story that I described to you in our first class about a man sitting alone in his living room, there was a lock on the door, or a man sitting alone in his living room and there was a knock on the door. That story was a work of horror or it was a work of terror because those possibilities exist outside the door. Our mind invents something, the possibilities in that ambiguity, that is far more horrifying than anything that the actual revelation of what is beyond that door could ever possibly be. Part of the terror of the unknown that Lovecraft describes is precisely that. We could only be disappointed by the certainty that comes with full objective revelations about the cause of the nature of the Orla. The lack of a concrete answer is the crux of the terror in this story. As the narrator doesn't seem to be able to reconcile contradictory evidence, he doesn't have enough, he doesn't have objective proof, so too do we. And I would argue that in broad brush terms, that is the nature of this weird tale. That is the nature of the terror that exists at its core. In this story, we are in many respects left trapped between interpretations. Maybe it's only us. Maybe everything that we see in this story is merely, well, a product of us, of our own diseased capacity for fancy and imagination and madness. The Orla is a psychological ailment, or maybe there really is something out there. That unknown, that possibility, is the very nature of the weird tale. In the next series of videos, we're going to be looking at the way in which Maupassant takes these ideas, uses them to construct the weird nature and the feelings associated with the weird, but also comments on a variety of different issues that we've already touched upon here: sanity and madness, reason, and things like scientific advancement. We have the narrator running scientific experiments in essence, and the Orla being possibly the evolution of life on this planet through unknown natural laws. Let's look at what Maupassant is saying about these kinds of issues as we move forward.